Good afternoon, and welcome to the Voice of Wisdom. With over 60 years of experience as an investment banker, entrepreneur, investment analyst, economist, and venture capitalist, Morty Davis is Wall Street and capitalism personified. The over 400 companies for which he has raised more than $3 billion over the years have created a countless number of jobs and exciting new products. Through the Voice of Wisdom, Mr. Davis explores, analyzes, and debates the most topical, economic, and social issues facing our world today. Joining Mr. Davis today for a discussion on balancing the federal budget is returning guest Ephraim Lowy. And now, Mr. Davis and Mr. Lowy.
Welcome back. It's great to be with you once again, every Wednesday evening at 6:30. I'm sorry that we're dealing with a subject that everybody has problems with, balancing their budget. But we're talking about bigger things. I always had to deal with my wife. That's why we got along so well together. I said, she told me, I'll take care of the little things, you could take care of the big things. So that sounded great to me. So she took care of all the little things, what we would buy, the food, the television, where we would send the kids to school, how much we would pay for tuition. And she let me decide who we go to war against, who do we make peace with, who do we fund in terms of other countries, foreign aid. So it worked out perfectly. I made the big decision. She made. It's the same with this subject. We all have the problem of balancing our budget and not overspending, especially since the onset of credit cards, you don't even feel like you're spending money. You just stick in a card or you're handing a card to the merchant, and till you get the bill, you don't realize how much you overspent. So the question today is, how dangerous that we're exceeding the amount of revenues the government takes in versus how much they spend. And last year, I think not me, although we all pay for it, the U.S. government spent, I think, something like 1.6 trillion more than it took in. So how long can we keep that up? Clearly, a family can't keep on spending more than it earns, than it takes in, plus what happens savings it can dig into. So how does the government get away with it? How come we don't go bankrupt? How come people still love our bonds? So this is the subject today. If you have any insights or any questions, send me we're not taking any quotes today, so send me your questions or your ideas or your recommendations. I really appreciate the wisdom of my listeners. You guys are great. I love you. So now let me hear from my esteemed guest, Ephraim Lowy, and see what he wants to add, how we can begin our debate or our agreement, whatever the case may be.
I think we're going to build on last week's agreement, Mr. Davis, and yes. I would say that not only is this topic apropos to the moment with what's going on, it's probably the single biggest issue on the planet that people don't understand. So if I were to ask everyone, some venture capital firms have something called a pre-mortem, right? Everyone's familiar with a post-mortem, right? Something blows up and something, goes kaput, and you try to figure out why. So the smart venture capital firms, the smart VC firms, do a pre-mortem. They say, if this business is going to die, let's figure out now what is going to kill it, right? So if I were to tell you that there is going to be a crisis, a global crisis that we can't get out of, what's the most likely thing to precipitate that? right? And I don't think you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to figure out that what's got us out of all financial crises before has been the federal government's ability to lever up and borrow more money. And should that ever not be available to us, well, then we have the underpinnings of the biggest crisis ever, right? So think about what's happened recently, what we spoke about last week, how there was a banking crisis and the Fed said, okay, well, we insure it, right? We're going to backstop it. Well, what if no one believes the Fed's backstop, right? What if the full faith and credit of the U.S. government is no longer worth the paper it's written on? So the number one destabilizing effect on this planet could potentially be the U.S.'s inability to fund the muscles that it flexes all over the world. So I think this is a great topic to be spoken about anytime, and definitely today.
You always do a great summary and a great introduction, but you started off, the first thing you said I disagreed with.
Is that a record for us?
No, almost everything you said was on target, but to me the greatest danger, what I worry about for my kids is the global warming, is the nature of the, what else is it called? Climate change. And there's so much evidence that could be our destruction, and even the total elimination of the ability human beings to even survive on the earth. So that's the number one.
I'll concede.
Okay.
We'll give this one number two.
Okay. Well, again,
Potentially.
I always tell you that in my view, the biggest thing that I worry about, both of those have to do with my kids and future generations. So global warming is imminent, even though there are many that say, well, it's not an issue, it's not going to happen till way late in the century, the end of the century. But there's evidence every single day of the drought, the water problems, the fires that are occurring in California, even the crop. Most of our food, our vegetation comes from California, and it's being overwhelmed by the outcomes that occur as a result of global warming. The other one is that I keep stressing is that I want to get the cure for the things that are going to kill my children. And not only kill them, but cost them a lot of money, wipe them out possibly, and torture them. Like, there's nothing worse than cancer or, any of these diseases that are,
Well, so if I could speak to that for 1 second.
Sure.
One, to speak to global warming for a minute, I think that you're 100% right, global warming is a huge issue, but the problem we have with confronting it is the same problem we have with the debt, right? So it's very hard to get people to focus on global warming, which is not a today problem, it's a tomorrow problem.
No, it's a today problem.
Well,
that's the mistake they made.
Fair. So, but the reason people aren't worried about it is because it's not today. It's not literally today, right? It's not putting food on the table this evening.
And they're not worried about cancer either because nobody in their family has it right now.
So all these issues, right, so like we mentioned last week, to the extent all self-help is choose long-term over short-term and don't have short-term thinking, right? That's what gets in the way of prioritizing something like global warming, because if one candidate, let's say, is running on global warming and the other one's I'm going to put dinner on the table, you're going to vote for dinner on the table. Now, one minor distinction I'll make in terms of the things, terrible outcomes of cancer or anything the like, is on those fronts we're actually making progress. Right? Whereas when it comes to global warming, when it comes to debt, we're going the opposite direction, right? So we're not making any progress with debt to GDP. But when it comes to cancer, there are constant scientific advancements, thank God, and we seem to be on the path towards curing it. And we don't have to do, again, we should intensify our efforts and increase the efforts and devote, like we've both agreed upon multiple times in the past, there's nothing more precious on this planet than a human life. But we appear to be following a path there. And when it comes to GDP, the debt ratio, or global warming, we seem to be going in the wrong direction. And so these are problems that are not being paid attention to, and definitely require the brain, the brain trust of ours.
What worries you about the deficit and
Yes,
and the total debt?
I'll go on a mild soliloquy here, if you'll indulge me, right?
No, you think we'll go bankrupt or something? Or?
Well, I think we could, right?
Never.
Why not?
Because we make our own currency. We could always pay off if
Sure.
the Chinese want to cash in all their bonds, we could
We can print it.
print it.
Well, okay, so but what
I'm not saying it wouldn't have a negative impact.
right. So if you trace all the global reserve currencies, again, not work I've done, work Ray Dalio has done, over the last 500 years or 1,000 years, if you want to include the Chinese, eventually, right, they print and inflate away their debts, and then they're no longer the world reserve currency. So let's think about, I just want to stress this point, that the full faith and credit of the U.S. government is backstopping every single transaction on the planet. I'll give an example, right? I'll give a simple example. Let's take every religious action we perform as practicing Orthodox Jews. Well, why do you do this? Well, because of this. Why this? Because the Torah said so. So what if the Torah said so? Everything comes back to one point. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm Hashem your God, right? We believe that there is Hashem, and therefore he dictated the following. Now, if you take that away, right, if Hashem didn't give the Torah, why do you follow the Torah? If there is no Torah, why do you follow? Everything is downstream from this one statement. Try it out with your kids. You say, hey, you got to go to sleep. Why? Because you got to do well on your test. Why? So you can get into graduate school. Why? So you can make it. Why?
Yeah.
Eventually, it's because I said so, right? If there's no because I said so.
Initially, the kids think of you as a torturer. You're the only one that bugs up their life, other than for your pushing them to do different things. They could do anything. So the initial view of you was, well, why is this guy in my life? Why is my mother in my life? You know?
Exactly. Well, let's do every transaction, right? So you buy a coffee for $5. Why does that person accept that $5? Well, because they can go turn around and use that $5. What do they do with that $5? They put it in the bank. Now, who says it's going to be there tomorrow, right? And again, this was a real concern 2 weeks ago. People did not know if their money would be in the bank. Right. So the fact that everything is ultimately backstopped by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, how does the U.S. government fund that? With debt that they issue, right? If the U.S. government should ever default on that debt, right, it's now a new world order where your $5 purchase is no longer guaranteed. And certainly our ability to dictate foreign policy elsewhere in the world, which is really we're only able to do so by flexing our economic strength. I think go back to World War II when the U.S. barely had a military, but what they were able to do was flex their industrial capacity to build a military, right? And ever since then, we've been a world power based on our ability to generate economic impact. So if the U.S. government fails as a financially viable institution, every single transaction is at stake. And to the extent you said you're right, we can always print our debt away. Well, let's say China's holding X amount of dollars, and the U.S. says, okay, we'll just print it and give it to you. What do you think China's going to do?
It's holding the largest portfolio of U.S. Treasury bonds.
Right. So, look at what happened at the end of World War I, right? When they tried to make Germany responsible for the war, eventually Germany printed their way out of it, and we got World War II. So hyperinflation doesn't work. It doesn't work for families who have people who are retired. They're in savings, right? You see how strong the government is trying to fight inflation. Inflation has its own set of issues. So the stability of everything in the world really comes back to the economic interest. Globalization is really based on, for the most part, people do what's best for them. And as long as we're economically intertwined with other countries, we all kind of play along nicely in the sandbox. But really, if you want to go again, the furthest upstream to say what guarantees my transaction at Starbucks, it's the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. And if that is called into question,
if that's true, how come Bitcoin is accepted? A friend of mine built some housing in Miami, beautiful housing, and he sold a penthouse for $24 million of Bitcoin. He accepted Bitcoin.
Yeah.
There's no backing.
well, that's exactly what it is, right? Bitcoin is
It's
designed to be an alternative to fiat currency.
Yeah, but there's no backing. So it's the faith of.
It's the faith and credit of people who use Bitcoin, right? So, okay, let's take away the U.S. currency, right? We can always barter in terms of real estate and cars and hard inflationary assets, right? Gold bars. If you can somehow wrap your head around the concept of Bitcoin being digital gold, which I'm not saying it is or it isn't, I'm just saying that's the theory, right? So Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were designed as a way against this, right? It's the out. If the U.S. ever decides to print their way out of debt or continue the way they have, which is constantly using inflationary practices, Bitcoin is in the code. There can never be more Bitcoin. You know this because Bitcoin has defined code. So do all cryptocurrencies. You cannot inflate Bitcoin. You cannot create more Bitcoin. It's very fixed.
But you could
create another crypto asset.
And they do.
Yes. Again, this is not. I'm not saying buy Bitcoin or buy crypto, but to the extent any exchange or any cryptocurrency demonstrates some staying power, it can have value, right? Like people. Let's go back to gold. People don't actually use all that much gold, right? It's an inflation hedge because it's an inflation hedge because it's accepted as an inflation hedge, right? Rare art, right? The mere fact that it's rare and that people want it makes it an inflation hedge. So again, I don't have much of an opinion on cryptocurrency, and I certainly wouldn't share any opinion I would have publicly, but that is the theory, right? The theory is have something that cannot be inflated away, that has a fixed amount, and the code itself dictates that it has a fixed amount. And by the way, for those who've been following Bitcoin, it's had a tremendous run-up this past week.
Yeah.
Again, as the government moved to backstop the banks, and it became clear that they can't raise interest rates indefinitely, and they do have to...
they raised it today, you know.
They raised a quarter of a point.
Right.
But let's see what happens, right? I don't think...
I'll give you one example of the difference between a country that can print its way out of bankruptcy and a country that couldn't. In 2008, during that recession, Great Recession, Greece was in terrible financial trouble. And the debt exceeded 100%, or much more than that, 200%, I think, of their GDP. And it looked like they wouldn't be able to pay their bonds or pay, you know, it looked like they would have to declare bankruptcy because they couldn't print their own money. They're subject to the euro printing, so in the end...
In the end, the euro bailed them out.
You bailed them out, right?
And behind the
But I'm
scenes,
saying,
who was bailing out the euro?
So we could never go bankrupt. And not only that, we look at our deficits in the wrong way. Because Japan has a bigger deficit than we do. But they've been stunted in their growth over the last 25 years, 30 years. Mm-hmm. Because they don't have a lot of natural resources. We're a very wealthy country. We have it all on the ground, either in different kind of mining opportunities and also in agriculture. We grow enough food to feed the whole world practically. So that's not on our balance sheet, you know? So it's not just the currency, it's what backs the currency, and America has a lot of backing for it has a lot of assets.
Yeah, look...
So that's the difference between a Greece or even, a country that could print their own money. Argentina forever is issuing bonds, and then they can't pay the bonds, they're renegotiating it, you know.
Look, all debt is borrowing, you're borrowing from your future assets, right? That could be natural assets, that could be intellectual assets, that could, right? We're borrowing from the future economy. Now the question is, how do you do it in a sustainable way, right? So I would ask, if anyone were to come say, hey, Mr. Davis, can I have a loan? You say, well, how do you plan on paying back? What are you doing with this money, right? And I think we've touched upon the past.
But also, what collateral could you put on?
What collateral could you, exactly.
So America has a lot of collateral. That's my point.
But at some point, right? At some point, we'll run out of collateral. I don't know when that is. At some point, we can't.
No, after the Second World War, we had just about the same relationship of debt to GDP. It was 115% of GDP. We ran it up during the war, and we spent a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately,
you paid it down.
Well, you don't necessarily pay it down. Remember, the debt is fixed. It's nominal. If you've got $1,000 bond, you got to pay back the $1,000 bond. If you have inflation,
right,
$1,000 is much easier to pay back. So inflation takes care of a lot of that. Right now, the only negative to inflation is it automatically, you don't have to do anything. You have more dollars available to pay off a nominal amount.
Well, that's a dirty...
The negative of it is the country's interest cost has gone up dramatically. So that hurts the deficit.
Right. So the dirty little secret is inflation is actually the best strategy you inflate the debt away, right? So if the debt stays in the same dollar terms, but you have inflation, right? So even though the Fed's mandate is to generate 2% inflation, the real long-term strategy to get out of the debt is if we had 4 or 5% inflation and GDP keeps up the pace, your debt to GDP is constantly going down. Right, but I think you actually touched upon something last week in an opinion we both shared. Is let's just think about this conceptually, right? If you were running a country, when would you be borrowing, and when would you be paying back?
The country would be in big trouble.
No, I disagree. Right, so the economy was doing fabulously a few years ago,
right?
And if you have any foresight, right, when your company is doing fabulously, that's the right time to have a rainy day fund, right? So what we didn't need was corporate tax cuts. And of course, look, I'm all for lower taxes.
Or individual tax cuts either. Particularly for the
wealthy, right?
For the top 10% or 1% even.
At the risk of being labeled something that I'm not, right? I'm all for tax cuts and lower tax rates and fiscal responsibility. But what if I were to offer everybody to pay 2% a year into a rainy day fund, right? You'd probably do it. So when the economy was doing amazing, what we really should be doing is paying down our debt, right?
Absolutely.
And looking ahead. And having that money for when the economy is not doing well, the government could reach into its backpack, pull out its quiver, and have the arrow of extra liquidity to shoot at that problem. But instead, of course, what did we do? We did corporate tax cuts, personal tax cuts, and all that is front-loading money and back-loading a problem, which, of course, at some point, you got to pay the reaper. The problem with this is here's the problem I see, is that you are really never going to get someone elected on this platform, right? So just imagine someone's running now, I'm going to raise taxes and cut spending to everything. I mean, who's going to vote for that guy, right? And someone running against him and goes, oh, I'm going to give out more benefits, right? It's impossible to run.
That's the theory, and I think it's largely true, that why Bush the father didn't get elected for a second term. Most presidents that get elected get a second term. It's because he said, read my lips, I'm never going to raise taxes. And then he proceeded to raise taxes so that the Republicans beat up on him and he didn't get reelected.
But if you were managing the CEO of this country, what is actually the best possible course of action right now is probably raising taxes, right? So
we can't.
You can't.
We can't.
So
that's Look, Keynes is a genius. Even the Republicans always have been against Keynes because his theme was the government is the what am I saying? Of the last resort. The last,
Borrower of last resort.
not the provider of last resort, or the government could step in when there's no demand, when people are doing poorly and they can't have no money to spend. That's what the 70% of the economy is consumer spending.
Right.
If suddenly the people at the bottom don't have money, you have a depression or a Great Depression if they're really in trouble and nobody does anything. So Keynes came up with this idea that the government should be the sponsor. What's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it should step in and spend money to replenish the demand. And once you replenish the demand, then the companies start to grow again. They hire people, and then people have money to their own people, so the government could step away. But Keynes said they loved that. So everybody, even Nixon at one point said, we're all Keynesians now. So even though the Republicans traditionally were against it, he liked the idea.
Just for the listeners, explain that Keynes is John Maynard Keynes, correct?
Right.
And he was economist at what time?
I think about 150 years ago, I think. Maybe a little more than that. But he was a genius, and he came up with this solution for times when there's no expenditures by people because they're tapped out. They've gone through a hard time. Companies aren't doing well. They lay off people. A lot of unemployment. In those days, there was not even unemployment insurance. So he came up with this idea. It's the what's the word I'm looking for? Of last resort.
Consumer, spender.
Len, what is it? What do you call it? Of last resort. I use it all the time in my book. I have it 40 times. Anyway.
So how would you attack this?
But Keynes' idea was, but when times are good, you replenish, you pay it down. So they like the first part of it, but when it comes to Congress raising, nobody likes to have their taxes raised. Nobody likes to have their, whatever their favorite deal is, their favorite program. Mm-hmm. Nobody likes to have that program cut. So they can only, do deficit spending, but repaying the deficit is impossible because the Congress would never vote for it. And the proof is Bush lost his re-election campaign because of that. But also one point you made earlier about the Bible and the nature of advice, it's always that the long term is created by the short term. So you can't say, I'll plan for the long term without doing something in the short term. So what you do today, what you and I do today, impacts our life for years and years to come. If we do something rewarding, worthwhile, we're going to get the benefits in the future. If we do something that's devastating or detrimental, then we'll pay the price in the future.
And how would you attack the deficit? What program would you implement?
It's really interesting that the Republicans are always the deficit hawks, right? They're always saying, we've got to cut the deficit, we've got to reduce the debt. The only one in the last 150 years that cut the deficit was a Democrat. Bill Clinton cut the deficit and had a surplus even. It was amazing, you know. Alan Greenspan, who's supposedly brilliant, he was the head of the economic advisors to the president, considered a genius. When we had the surplus, he said, "Oh my God, the government won't have to issue bonds, so where will people put the money?" And I thought, this guy's the biggest moron, because he thought because we had 1 year or 2 years of a surplus that we wouldn't be needing money or they wouldn't go out to borrow money. It never happened, you know, so it was sort of a nonsensical statement. But that's true of a lot of geniuses. They're a genius till they're stupid.
Well, they're a genius in the classroom, right? But no, more specifically, right? How would you get the deficit in line, or would you not?
No, let's look at what Clinton did.
How would you do it today?
You raise taxes. I told you we had the same thing after the Second World War, 115%. You know what they raised the marginal rate to after the Second World War?
I do not.
Over 90%.
Really?
So people said, well, it doesn't even pay to go to work once you reach that. But people worked anyway, because they keep something and they do it. You know, if you stop working, then you lose the talent or you lose the future. You know, you don't stop working and you don't stop working your factory saying, I'm not going to keep anything, and then once you close it down, you can't get it up when you want to. So it's just like oil. I think you're aware of that. Oil reached the point about 1.5 years ago where they paid you $40 to take a barrel of oil. You remember that?
Yeah, that was early on in COVID.
And you know why they did that? Why didn't they just shut down their production?
Because there are actually costs to capping an oil rig, right? So,
well, the cost is that a lot of times when they reopen it, it yields much less or it disappears completely. So they would never want to do that. And at that time, every storage place, every tanker in it was full and every warehouse was full. They didn't have it, you know, it probably still is. But they've managed to cut the output between the Russians and OPEC. So they sort of, it's not that they got rid of all that warehouse.
Well, so here's my
question. So I'm saying that
the
the same thing happens when you close a factory. You lay off people, then when you need them back, it's not
here's
readily
the
available.
problem. The only people running on platforms to raise taxes are not running on austerity measures. They're running on platforms to raise taxes and increase entitlements, right? So to use your terminology, Republicans don't want to raise taxes, the Democrats do, but the Democrats don't care about the budget. So they want to raise taxes to
pay down the deficit?
No, to increase. They actually want to increase spending, and increase entitlements and increase welfare. And
well,
right,
as long as you raise taxes enough to eliminate the deficit,
but
you're
that's
doing
not
anything.
actually in anyone's plan, right? So just walk us through the numbers. I think.
Well, let me tell you this. This is interesting. In the book I'm writing now, the best times we ever had is when we had a 90% top tax, the
Marginal tax dollars?
marginal tax,
Why is
over
that?
90%. And the worst times we had is when we had the lowest tax.
Well, I think that's hard to look forward in today's day and age, because if you have a marginal tax rate above a certain number, the ease with which someone can just simply move to another country is a lot different than back in the day, right? So back in the day, if you
People don't move to another country.
Oh, they do with a 90% tax rate.
Very, very few people.
I guarantee
And if they're doing,
100%
if they're doing
of
great in
billionaires.
this country and they want to move to another country and they can't do great,
So,
they're not moving.
So that you actually don't
There's no
have
other.
to physically.
What country would they move to?
Let me just tell you, you move the marginal tax rate above a certain number, and 100% of billionaires will be domiciled outside the U.S. 100%.
That's
And
not-
they will spend 6
Never-
months of the year in
never-
Antigua or
never-
Barbados.
Remember, the marginal tax rate is only at the top, the cream at the top. It's not for the first,
Yeah, but
Not-
one second. The marginal tax rate right now is above $500,000. That's the highest tax rate there is, right?
no,
So
that's not a $500,000. It's what do you call it? It's a percentage. It's not an amount.
no, the marginal tax rate is a percentage, but you begin paying that percentage above, I don't know, about $500,000, maybe a little less. You're in the highest tax bracket above $500,000, right? To the best of my knowledge. So. Look, I know people who have moved to Puerto Rico for tax advantages. We all know people who've moved to Florida to get rid of
For
state
sure,
level taxes, right? So you're telling me if the marginal tax bracket goes to 90%, every single billionaire is not being domiciled in.
I'm not suggesting it go to 90%,
Give
but
me
I'm showing.
any unreasonable number, and that's what you'll get. You won't actually gain any tax revenue, right? So to gain tax revenue,
If it went to 50%, would they move out of the country?
if it went to it already is 50%.
No, it isn't.
Between federal, state, and local, it's pretty close.
I'm not talking about
Just federal? If it was
just
50?
federal, yeah. What I said
I don't know.
before was the federal was 90%.
Got it.
And it was the best of times, the best economy we ever had.
I can't speak to that. I'm just
I'll
not
show
sure
you
it's
the number.
replicable.
I'll show you the number.
I believe you. I'm just not sure it's replicable in today's day and age, right? So back then,
I'm not suggesting you do 90%.
well, above a certain number, people move, right? I say personally, if my tax bracket moved past a certain number, it would pay to move to a different country. There are other countries on the
Yeah.
planet you could live in,
So,
right?
so you'd lose some people.
No, I just don't think you not only would you lose some people,
You'd lose the greedy,
lose
the most greedy people
Well-
who would go for a less quality life.
it doesn't matter. You
There's
just,
people live in America because it's the best life in the world. If they move to
people live in
where
America.
where would they move to?
I can give you a list of places.
Yeah, where?
Pick any island, right? America is the best country in the world, but a billionaire can have the best country in the world anywhere, right?
That's not true.
Uh,
That's not true. You're isolated on an island. You don't have the same quality.
again, they can spend 6 months a year traveling, and they can be domiciled elsewhere. But the fact is, again, it's a price elasticity question. You're not you raise taxes above a certain percent, and you're just not going to raise revenue because you're going to lose people. It just doesn't work, right? So, in my opinion, you definitely should raise taxes. I think corporate taxes should be raised, but it needs to be combined with other ideas, right? And I think
No, so let me tell you what Clinton did. First of all, he raised taxes on corporations, on individuals, on anybody he could raise taxes on. And he didn't raise it, to some ridiculous number. Let me see if I have it here. During his tenure in '93, in '93, the deficit, or the debt was 66% of the GDP. It went down from 66.1 to 63.9 to 61.2 to 57.4 to 54.8 to 53.7. So from 66, about 14% during his tenure. And he didn't raise taxes all that much. He raised taxes on individuals. He raised corporate taxes only 1% from 34 to 35. He raised individual taxes pretty big amount from 31% to almost 40%, 39.6. That's a big raise. He raised, and then he did spending cuts. That's what you got to do. You got to do spending cuts. You got to do raised taxes on high-income individuals and corporations. And over the 5 years, raising those taxes, he got $240 million, and he cut defense spending. So
Right.
the defense spending during his tenure went from 291 billion to 267
Now, what are your
billion.
thoughts about cutting defense spending now?
I think we should cut it to almost zero. I told you I wanted the defense against the things that are going to kill us. To me, the worst thing that's happened since the Second World War is we've become a belligerent country. We're in more wars than anybody, and it's supposedly we're the good guys. You know, we're criticizing Putin for attacking Ukraine, and there's some basis for trying to get Ukraine because it was part of the Soviet Union. We attacked Iraq for bullshit reasons. We said they have weapons of mass destruction. It turned out we never did. They never did. We lost tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. We've ruined Iraq. They still haven't recovered. And what right did we have to do that?
Yeah.
Well, why are we so critical of when and we go into Vietnam? What business do we have going into? They're going to become communists. They have a right to become whatever they want. Well, why do we have to dictate to the world what they should be? So I'm saying with defense, they say it keeps you out of war because as Reagan said, if you have a strong military, a strong armaments, strong defense spending, it prevents you from going to war. People are afraid to start up with you. And he's right. We've never been attacked on this country, on our territory, on our land, in our whole history. But we've been in more wars than any other country. So what is that? Defense spending, or is that offense spending?
Yeah, I think, I believe...
That always hurts people, because if you say America's belligerent, you're like at least a Nazi or a communist or a socialist, whatever pejorative word they can come up with. And the thing it is really so stupid that they don't realize that their kids are going to die not from attack by a country or a terrorist. They're going to die from the thing that kill all of us: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, all the things that kill it. Why don't we spend that money on defense?
Yeah.
Well, what? You think we're spending it the right way?
I don't. I think, Eisenhower warned on his way out about the military-industrial complex, and the machinery behind it is such that it almost extracts this money from the government, and just a handful of companies. There are defense items that are only bid for by a single contractor, and you're not going to have fair pricing in that regard. So we definitely should cut defense spending, but it should. The point is not to spend less or be any less secure. It's to spend smarter, right? And in today's day and age,
why not spend less? Why?
You can spend less. I'm just saying, regardless of whether you're spending more or less, you should spend smarter.
It's the biggest part of our budget.
Well,
it's the single biggest item in our budget.
Again, I'm no military expert. I think what percent of our budget is it? About 10%?
It's $750 billion out of, what's the total budget?
Spend 6.3 billion. So 750.
What?
Sorry, trillion. So 750 billion. Yeah, it's 12%, right? So it's exactly 12%.
The biggest part of our budget.
Russia spends 33% of their of their GDP, of their budget on defense. So you certainly can't let things get out of balance with Russia or China. I don't claim to have any idea what the right
It doesn't
number
matter
should
what
be.
they spend. They don't have anywhere in the arsenal that we have.
At some
And
point
China
they
doesn't
will.
have-
At some point they will if we're continuously outspent. So, but I think you can always spend smarter, right? A way to spend less is to spend smarter.
Incidentally, Russia never attacked the United States. Why do we always say we have enemies? Russia's an enemy. Now China's become an enemy. Why do we have enemies? Why don't we have friends? Why don't we have, we put tariffs, Trump put tariffs on stuff from
I don't
China.
know if it's enemies or friends. It's a balance of power.
It's an attitude.
Well,
Yeah,
but
but
it's a
why?
balance of power.
Yeah, well,
Okay, so the world terms get dictated, right? Everything in life on some level is a negotiation, and every negotiation is about leverage.
China's winning that war, the balance of power, because they're using their economic strength to win the world over.
Correct.
We're using our military strength to win, and that's not the right way
Well,
to
so
win.
this goes back to everything we were saying before, right? Ultimately, on some level, everything's a negotiation. All negotiations are about leverage, and our leverage is some combination of our military and economic strength.
And clearly that's not working.
I don't know what you mean by it's not working. The question is how do we get it to
Why are
work?
we in more wars than any other country? All the ones we criticize, Russia, China, none of them are in as many wars as we are.
Again, Russia started this war we're in now, right? And Russia annexed
Yeah,
Crimea
so
a few
they,
years ago.
they started one war,
Got it.
and we started Iraq, Afghanistan,
We started Afghanistan?
of course.
I'm not sure I would categorize it that way. I think
What do you mean?
September 11th started Afghanistan.
What are you talking about? That was the excuse. But it wasn't Afghanistan that attacked us. It was what's his name? Osama bin Laden, who was in Afghanistan.
Was being protected by Afghanistan.
So we should have gone after them, just like we did finally in Pakistan. We got them. But why do you go to war for 20 years, spend trillions of dollars, lose tons of lives, just so you could get even for 3,000 people that we lost on? I'm not saying that wasn't terrible.
Yeah.
To me, I don't even understand why Biden, they're apologetic for getting out of Afghanistan. I would make that the biggest thing, the best thing he's done.
Yeah.
Because we'd be there another 10 years. We'd lose more. We lost 13 people that day, so they made and left a lot of armaments there, which we don't need anyway. And that was the major catastrophe.
We can-
We got out.
We,
We still are not out of Iraq.
we can spend a lot of time talking about wars and who started them and whether or not they're justified.
No, but I'm not making up facts. The fact is we've been in more wars than any other country in the world, and we've never been attacked.
I think when you are dictating and
We're the biggest dictator. We want to dictate our values to the rest of the world.
when you're conveying, again, it's completely its own discussion. But when you have
Okay.
the most at stake, right? Let's put it this way: we're also funding the entire world, right? So when you have the most at stake,
We're
right?
funding the entire world with armaments.
It's just everything comes back to America, right?
Yeah.
That-
Why don't we fund them with things that improve their lives instead of funding them? We spend so
I
much
think
money in
I think
Iraq.
you're cherry picking data here. I think we constantly.
Which state am I cherry
I'll
picking?
explain. I think we're constantly funding other countries, funding all their socioeconomic needs. I think we contribute mightily to the improvement of lives in many third world countries. I think that's primarily the U.S.'s goal. Now, it doesn't justify any war. It does not justify any war. We have a foreign policy, and to the extent countries are able to work together in the UN, we're a part of that group of nations. To the extent we try to promote our values elsewhere, we try to promote our values elsewhere. And of course, by being super involved, it's going to lead to some skirmishes. I don't think
An overwhelming amount of money that we give to other countries, we give it to them so they could buy our our biggest export.
What are the numbers on that?
I don't have it handy.
Yeah. So, again, trying to rein the conversation back into the actual budget and the deficit, right? I applaud an effort for a tax raise.
You have to cut where you spend it. So the Republicans say cut Social Security, cut Medicare. That's cruelty. Why not cut defense spending?
Again,
Or leave it. I'm in favor of leaving it, but spending it on things that will defend our lives.
all sounds good. Again, I would go through the numbers
What do you mean
here.
sounds good?
You can't just say cut. It's impossible to throw out an idea without really understanding the practicalities, right? So cut defense spending by what? Not that I understand.
Which part?
So cut.
I said don't cut it at all.
So don't cut.
Move it to. I'm in favor of using that money for defense against the things that are going to kill every senator, every congressman, every president, and all their children and grandchildren.
So with defense spending reallocated, right, and increasing taxes by what percent?
I don't know, whatever we need. You know, that the top 10% should be increased by, 20%, 30%. Yeah.
I just don't see that being as I don't see it practically working out, in my opinion. You raise taxes by.
Why don't we just cut it by the amount that Trump reduced it for them?
I'm all in. I was against those tax cuts.
Yeah. Okay.
So there is another path, right? The other path is just being really astute and smart about where we fund, where we invest our money. I think we've spoken about this a couple of times. Investing in education and infrastructure. These are investments.
I'm all in favor of that, but that's idealistic.
Well, I'm not sure it's idealistic.
Because
who wouldn't go on with an education bill or an infrastructure bill?
The Republicans wouldn't go on, and they haven't gone on.
Yeah.
And all the time they were in power, anytime. Since, I thought Eisenhower was a terrible president because nothing exciting happened. He never got big credit for being in the Second World War. In retrospect, I said, what a great president he was. And his 8 years, nothing, no wars, none, unless you have a war and you win a war, you're not a big hero.
Right.
It's what happens during your regime. And notwithstanding that, he still warned against the military-industrial. The guy who understood it the most was the one that recommended it.
It's like being a referee. If anyone knows your name, you've done poorly, right? If anything happened, right, no one goes, "Hey, ref, amazing game you called." Let me throw out another scenario, okay?
I'm glad you just thrown out a scenario.
Well, I just
you're not throwing me out.
I think here's what's most likely, right?
Yeah.
Raising taxes and cutting spending, while might work, I just don't see anyone running on that platform and getting reelected. So you just said, right, the only president the president that didn't get reelected was Bush because he raised taxes. And it's just a rule. People, if you offer to give them money,
but Clinton could have won a third term.
He could have.
He was very popular.
He was very popular.
And he raised taxes.
Here's an irony, though, right? Most presidents inherit an economy, right? So anything a president does, you're not actually going to see show up in the economy for 2 to 3 years, right? So, Trump inherited Obama's economy, and Biden inherited Trump's economy, and so on and so forth. If a president is president for 8 years, then his second term he's actually responsible for what happened because he did it in his first term.
When Trump inherited Obama's economy, it was on the rise.
It was on the rise. And by the way, a dirty little secret. What did Obama inherit? The Great Recession from Bush, right? From Bush and our friend Greenspan. So Obama inherited a disaster, handed Trump a booming economy, yet everyone thinks, Obama, terrible. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I like George Bush. I know him personally. But he had to be, in retrospect, the worst president because he entered a war that we shouldn't have entered. He gave a big tax cut during the war. Usually, you're spending more during the war. You raise taxes so you could pay for the war. He did just the opposite. He didn't want the war to hurt the people that make the decisions, the donors. So he cut their taxes so they shouldn't scream. Just like he avoided the draft so the Trumps wouldn't get drafted. The wealthy kids wouldn't get drafted.
Right. So here's what's actually happened 100% of the time over the last 500 years, which is governments have inflated their debt away because austerity measures never work. People get fat and lazy and they don't take pay cuts. And if you've ever been to the DMV and tried to get something done, it's not the most efficient place in the world. Nor is anyone who works for the government efficient. The governments are not efficient by nature. Free markets are. So for the most part, what ends up happening on some way, shape, or form is the debt gets inflated away. On some level, we go back to what you said in the beginning of the podcast, the government's printing the money. The most calm method of that is keeping low interest rates for a long time, which again, today we had the Fed raise another quarter. But if you think about it, all the stress in the banking system is a direct result of the raise of
the low interest rate,
of the rise in interest rates over the last over the last 6 months, and I'm not entirely sure the economy can support it. And just think about the debt service on $31 trillion of debt when it comes due. If interest rates are 5%, right, then the debt service alone is going to be
the debt service has gone up.
It's going to be
dramatically.
It's going to be
I think that's
close to 10%
is that the
GDP.
biggest item or second biggest item? Interest expense.
So on some level, if you're asking me where it is going to shape up, regardless of what should happen, it's all going to end in some sort of
Tragedy.
well, a slow tragedy, right? Which is not a slow tragedy. What we're going to do is constantly always try and bring interest rates up, but have to bring them down and inflate the debt away. And hopefully, there is one more thing: is if technology significantly improves GDP or individual productivity, right? Then you can actually see GDP keep up with inflation, and the GDP cover the debt service.
Certainly helps.
So
Clinton. That helped Clinton a lot.
The beginning of the internet and technology.
Right.
So constantly investing in technology, education, and infrastructure is our path out. I think we only have a few minutes left, and there's one more topic you wanted to touch on.
Contrary to what the Republicans always say, if you cut taxes, if you raise taxes, you hurt the economy and so forth. He raised taxes, and we had the best economy for, I think, forever. Nobody ever had that kind of growth. So, if you do things smartly, and he cut welfare too, so he didn't. He said you got to have a job. He cut the cost of welfare dramatically. Now, I just wanted to say that you say 500 years. I know you think I'm old, but I wasn't. I can't comment on the whole 500 years.
I thought Keynes was your childhood buddy.
Right. Anyway, we're at the very end, so let me end with some advice, because I love my listeners, and I wrote a book called Happiness Guaranteed or Your Misery Back. It's 365 pages every single day. The subtitle is How to Be Happy No Matter What. And I'll just give you one idea. I've given you some ideas in the past. If you want to be happy, every day when you get up, count your blessings. Your fingers work, your eyes work. Think of that. If you didn't have those assets, and those are the real assets. But you're also in America, when much of the rest of the world, particularly Africa and parts of Asia, a large part of the world has a life not even approaching America. So each of you count your assets, and don't count the other person that he has more. It's not relevant. If you got all the things you need, and you have an opportunity to improve your life, you can't have anything better. And don't be competitive in terms of material things. Be competitive in terms of your investment in your kids, because that's the biggest payoff, and your wife and your friends. That's the biggest reward. Anyway, try it. Even make it a point to list your assets. You know, I have a friend. His kid was born with a cancer in his eye at birth, and he tells his other kids, "Do you appreciate that your eyes work? Do you appreciate that your hands work? Do you appreciate when you walk out and you see the colors of the different flowers and the different things to see in the world? We don't appreciate all the things around us. You know, there was a song, "The best things in life are free. The sun in the morning, the moon at night, the sand on the beach. Everything that really matters is that you're, what is it called? Available quest. It's instantly available to you." There's a proverb like that. Anyway, God bless you. I love you. Have a great week. Every day should be better than the day before, and most important, good health.